So our theme verse is Psalm 11:3. If the foundation be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And of course, that's been the premise of teaching Baptist history. The typical modern day Baptist doesn't have a whole lot of clue about their Baptist heritage, and I don't think that that's right. I think that we should have a fairly good working knowledge of our history, and so that's why we're doing this. And as I've been studying this, we're going to get up into the 1680s today. But as I've been studying this, every time I study it, I come away with the thought that these guys took stands for things that we take for granted, and they were willing to take these stands at the loss with the idea that they could lose everything. They could lose their homes, and they did. One of the men, Thomas Gould, we'll talk about tonight, did lose everything. And so we'll get into it. So anyway, our primary focus tonight will be on Henry Dunster, who I mentioned on Wednesday, excuse me. And can anybody remember what we said about Henry Dunster? What was his position? I know you know, Elaine, you're reading the book. Anybody remember? He was the first president of Harvard. And he was also one of the guys that brought over he didn't bring over the printing press, so we'll get into it. So Henry Dunster, Thomas Gould, they were the fourth and fifth men who advanced the Baptist cause in the early history of the colonies at great cost to themselves. The others that we've already mentioned being Roger Williams, John Clark, and Obadiah Holmes. And it's not that there weren't any other people taking a stand with them. There were many others that took a stand with them, but they were the leaders, and they paid the greatest price. And that's always the key. There may be many people that agree with a certain position, but it takes someone who's willing to actually stand and lead before those folks will follow. And so being in a position of leadership, that's part of the price you pay. And as we've mentioned, this already relates to the first printing press that came to the English colony, so I thought we'd start with that. It just really didn't play into the story too much, but it just how it all works out. Joseph Glover married his wife Elizabeth in 1630 in Surrey, England. Joseph was the rector, which is the same, I guess, as a pastor of St. Nicholas Church, an Anglican church there. And he had been in that position since 1624, and his first wife died. And this is another aspect of all of this that really struck me, that if you married a spouse then, it's likely that that wasn't going to be the first spouse that you had or the only spouse that you had, because the good possibility existed that one or the other were going to die, right? And which is the case here. So his first wife died, and then he married Elizabeth. And for 6 years after they were married, he continued in his position as rector of that church, but then he began to side with the separatists and the nonconformists, and eventually, because he started preaching favorably about them, he had to leave. He was forced out of his position. And he saw the press. He was a forward-thinking man, and he saw the press as a means of advancing the cause, and he worked tirelessly to get one to take over to the colonies. He was going to use it over there to advance the separatist cause, and because of that, of course, is where freedom of religion was, so they thought. And then the initial Puritan settlers in the colonies also saw the need for a press, because they knew that as they developed the land and built schools, that they were going to need materials to teach, and a printing press was a necessity. So they were very favorable to the whole idea as well. So he secured the funding to buy the press and establish a business in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in June of 1638, he departed by ship with his wife and children. They had an indentured servant named Samuel Day and his family, who was going to actually run the press, and they had their press. But in the middle of that trip, somewhere along the way, Joseph died, and they buried him at sea. and they don't know exactly what the cause was. They think it may have been smallpox. But he had prepared for his family in Boston by buying a house, but his wife Elizabeth, his widow now, wanted to be near Harvard, which is where they were going to be working with. And so she bought a house in Cambridge. And I was reading, she bought, at the time, they were wealthy, so she bought the nicest house in Cambridge, right across the street from Harvard, and she put the press there. And she was well known for all of the furniture and the china and the silver that she had in the house, as well as the house itself. What's interesting that after she died, the only thing that survives to today is one piece of silver, which is in Harvard, and the press. Everything else is gone. And interestingly, the press was used after it was removed from Mr. Dunster and Elizabeth. It was used for 150 years, which is pretty interesting. How would a press in the advancing technology of the day that was built in the late 1600s have been, or mid 1600s, have been suitable to use for 150 years? It was used here in New Hampshire, and then it ended up in Vermont, where I think it still is. So that'd be interesting to see. But anyway, she was there across the street from Harvard, and she ended up printing, as we mentioned, The Oath of a Free Man, which was written by Governor John Winthrop. As I mentioned, the only original hand copy, the only copy that's existent there is the original hand copy that was written by Winthrop himself. And an almanac, there's no copies that exist, so if you could find one of those, you'd be able to retire. And then the Bay Psalm book, and there were 1,700 of those printed, and only 11 exist. So, and like 4 or 5 of them are in very poor condition. And Henry Dunster was born in 1612 in England, and he was a very well-educated man. It was said he was a man of great ability, who he was fluent in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And he came to Boston in 1640. So Elizabeth had arrived in 1638 and moved to Cambridge. He got there in 1640. He was single, never been married, and he was immediately installed as the president of, at the time, newly established Harvard College in Cambridge, and he served in that capacity for about 14 years. He was a Puritan, and he stood by the Puritan values, and he attended the Standing Order Congregational Church that was there until he was removed. And it was during that time he really built up Harvard. Harvard was fairly small, and he even devoted 100 acres of his own land, so he was fairly well. I think it was probably 100 of Elizabeth's acres, but or had been hers. But he devoted 100 acres of his own lands, and he engaged in quite a building project, raised a lot of money, and spent all of his time building up the college, and he actually used the students to help build. So would that happen today? I don't think so. We're going to have you paint a building today. First, you're going to build it. No, I don't think so. So he married Elizabeth Glover in 1641, and she had 2 of her own children by Joseph, and Joseph had 3 by his previous wife. So there were 5 kids in the mix. And when she died in 1643, Henry, who had moved in with her into her house, assumed responsibility for all 5 children, as well as inheriting her estate and press. So she only lived for a few years after coming to the States. So her husband died at sea, and then she died in 5 years later. And so she was only married to Henry Dunster for 2 years. And I believe I read that they had 2 children too. That's pretty quick, but they had a couple of children. And then he married another Elizabeth in 1644, and she outlived him. He died in 1659, so he didn't live to be very old. And they had they had 5 children together. So in all, they had 10 children in their household, right? And a lot of kids. But we mentioned that we talked about Obadiah Holmes in our last class. He was whipped in 1651. So at that point, Dunster had been the president of Harvard for about 11 years. But at about the 8-year mark, he had begun questioning infant baptism and the standing order. And I don't know how much influence his first wife had, because if you recall, she and her husband had been forced out of their position because of their separatist views, and had come from England for religious liberty. And Dunster had as well, because that was he was a Puritan. But it seems that when Holmes was whipped in 1651, that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And Dunster, being the man of character that he was willing to stand for what he believed. And Thomas Armitage, says that Dunster was so stirred in his mind, talking about with Obadiah Holmes, that he turned his attention to the subject of infant baptism and soon rejected it altogether. And one of the reasons was the King James Bible. So the first Bible that they used when the settlers first came over was the Geneva Bible, which was in the line of the King James Bible. It wasn't a bad Bible, but by 1640, it was already very well established. And so it had become ubiquitous at that point, where more and more people had it. And Dunster, being a scholar, began to study it. And you can't study the Bible, or anyone who studies God's Word, with the idea that God is going to speak truth to him. And that's how you have to look at it. When you start reading the Bible, when you read the Bible, God's speaking truth to you. And you're not looking to countermand it or pick it apart. It's like, this is what God's tried to tell me, and it's truth. So he began to study it, and that truth, that infant baptism was baptismal regeneration, that became a conviction for him, and he began to stand for it. And that's what it's all about. You read it, you see the truth, it becomes a conviction, and then you take a stand on it. So in 1653, he began to preach against baptism, infant baptism, in the Congregational Church at Cambridge, which understandably alarmed the whole town. And he was indicted by a grand jury for his crime, as they called it, and sentenced to a public admonition, sentenced to behaving better, and he had to resign his Harvard presidency, all because he was preaching against infant baptism. It was said of him that he was, quote, one of the greatest masters of the Oriental languages that hath been known in these ends of the earth. But he laid aside all his honors and positions in obedience to his convictions. His testimony against infant baptism was very strong. So again, we think we don't see that as an issue, but it was a big issue then. It could be a life-threatening issue. After an infant was baptized, Dunster was in church. An infant was baptized, and Dunster publicly protested and said, "There is an action now to be done which is not according to the institution of Christ, that the exposition as it had been set forth was not the mind of Christ, that the covenant of Abraham," which was the act of circumcision of an 8-day-old male baby, was the justification. That's what they taught for infant baptism. "Is not a ground of baptism, no, not after the institution thereof. That there were such corruptions stealing into the church, which every faithful Christian ought to bear witness against." And we may not have the same corruption today, but the truth still holds that when corruption seek to enter into the church, as faithful Christians, we stand against it. And it's no different for us. So a very practical value in what we're reading here. A man named Mr. Mitchell, he was the pastor of the church, went to show Dunster the error of his ways, and said that Dunster's arguments were so hurrying and pressing that he had a strange experience. And I didn't quote all of this, but he basically said that I don't care what he says, I'm not going to change my views. Even if he can prove from the Bible that my views are wrong, I'm not changing them, which is pretty much what all those guys did. And the real issue was that what he was really saying was that Dunster was able to masterfully and biblically defend his position against the standing order, which, by the way, we should all be able to do. You should all be able to biblically explain and argue your position from this. Every Christian should be able to do that. On April 7th, 1657, Dunster was arraigned for refusing to have his infant child baptized, and he was following the lead of Thomas Gould, who had come to similar conclusions about the same time, but it was through Dunster's preaching that Gould began to look into the matter. David Benedict points out that it was Dunster's own preaching against infant baptism that led Thomas Gould to look into it. And Dunster bonded out of going to jail, because they were going to put him in jail at this point, and moved to Scituate. Is it Scituate or Scituate? Moved to Scituate in the Plymouth colony, where Armitage says he maintained his manly protest, right? And that's really what a man is, isn't it? A man is someone who is willing to take a stand, who has the moral courage to stand without compromise. I don't know what, Dunster was a scholar, so he obviously wasn't like Elkanah or one of those guys, in the Bible. He was a bookworm, right? But he was a man of courage, and so he maintained his manly protest in the Plymouth colony. But it was Dunster's stand, and the reason why he's important, it was his stand that brought many to think about the orthodoxy of infant baptism. And he did it right in the heart of Boston, right in Cambridge, right in the teeth of the devil's lair, so to speak, which was important because Roger Williams, if you recall, had been banished and had to move and start Providence. And then John Clark had to move and start a church in Newport, and Obadiah Holmes had been whipped, and he was banished, and he was in John Clark's church down in Newport. So they had driven out most of the leaders. But Dunster wasn't just any old guy. He was the president of Harvard College. And so he was extremely well respected. He was a man of great ability. He was a man of great learning. And so when he began to preach against it, it was a whole different ballgame. So when he preached, that had a tremendous impact on the people in the Boston area, which was important and played a big part in what was going to take place in the next few years. The standing order knew, the magistrates, the religious civil magistrates, knew that rejecting infant baptism would lead to a free church, a free state, and a free conscience. They knew if they gave that up, that they were going to lose people to worship in their own way. I think they knew they couldn't defend it from the Bible because they tried to suppress, as people who don't like the truth do, they tried to suppress the truth. And if you can't argue against the truth, what do you do with it? If you're not willing to bow to the truth, you shut the truth down, or at least you attempt to. So that's what they did. And it's probably true that some of the leaders believed that they were doing God a service. Maybe. But I tend to believe that they were much like the Pharisees, and they knew that their stranglehold on power would be broken if they allowed people to believe and practice according to their own conscience. And that was what it was all about. And as I mentioned earlier, Henry Dunster died in February 1659. But what's interesting is that the 5 children from his first wife that he had raised as his own sued him for their mother's inheritance and belongings, no doubt because they had turned against him because of his stand. And he lost the suit. So he had to give up everything. But what's interesting is that Dunster now, when I was reading Armitage about him, that was in the late 1880s, 1886, Dunster was looked on very favorably by history and by Harvard. And I do believe that one of their own dormitories now is named Dunster Hall. And he's actually buried in Cambridge on Harvard, and there's a monument to him there. So they still, I don't know if they still do now, but they looked quite favorably on him after the fact. David Benedict said of Dunster, "What progress President Dunster made in his pursuit of Baptist principles, I do not find, but it does not appear that he ever openly espoused the Baptist cause. However, a Captain Cudworth, who must have leaned towards the Baptist faith, remarked of Dunster, "Through mercy we have yet among us worthy Mr. Dunster, whom the Lord hath made boldly to bear testimony against the spirit of persecution. Though he may never have officially become a Baptist, his influence and stand for freedom of conscience influenced many others." So Thomas Gould was one of them. So it was that seed of influence that brought about the first true Baptist church in Boston. Thomas Armitage writes, "For more than a generation, Baptists had been struggling for a footing there in Boston. And after Dunster's death, and with the rise of Thomas Gould as the leader, it was secured. And they still faced a lot of persecution, but they began to make some progress. Armitage actually called the persecution the Puritan Inquisition. If you know anything about the Catholic Inquisition, you know that it was very brutal and that men devised, we think of the Holocaust as being awful, and it was, no question about it, but it didn't start with the Nazis. It started long before then. And the things that men can devise to hurt other men are diabolic in nature. So he correctly termed it the Puritan Inquisition, because it was so fierce. And as a side note, to prove the point, but related to it, other religious sects were also severely persecuted during this time. For example, Mary Dyer and 3 other men were hanged for being Quakers in 1660. Mary Dyer and her husband had become sympathetic to the separatist cause while in Boston after coming from England in the 1630s. And after they became sympathetic to the cause, they were disenfranchised and disarmed, right? Then she and her husband ended up moving to Rhode Island to worship as they pleased. They weren't Quakers yet. And while in Boston, Mary, but before they had moved to Rhode Island, Mary had had a stillborn child that was severely disformed. And the leaders attributed that to her heretical views, so-called. She left for England in 1651, and she stayed there for 5 years. And while she was in England, she converted to Quakerism. And on her return, she came back to Boston. She was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. So these are the things that are going on while the Baptists were being persecuted. The Puritans would not tolerate anyone assembling anywhere else with like-minded people, regardless of their religious belief. But at that point, there were some that seemed to have some scruples. Beller says it's because she was a beautiful woman, which apparently she was a very beautiful woman. So, ladies, you've got it all. You got it easy, right? But she didn't have it easy. I'm only joking. About her impending hanging, and so it was put off for a year. But then they ended up putting her on the gallows, and she said at her hanging, "Nay, I cannot save my life. For in obedience to the will of the Lord God I came, and in his will I will abide faithful to the death." So praise the Lord for that, right? So she took a stand and was willing to die for what she believed. So that brings us to Thomas Gould. And he was the primary driving force behind the establishment of a Baptist church in the Boston area, and he also suffered the most for it. Like Dunster, the whipping of Obadiah Holmes had made a profound impression on him. He was very much, I was reading his own testimony in Isaac Backus' history. He has the entire written testimony of Thomas Gould in it. It's very long. I didn't read the whole thing, but he made the point. He said, "I was very much in favor of infant baptism for many, many years." I was telling my family at the dinner table tonight, what's interesting is he was the same generation as Roger Williams and John Clark and Obadiah Holmes. He died about the same time. But he didn't come into the picture as a Baptist leader until after. They were still leading, but their persecution had ended more or less to the same, because they had moved to Rhode Island. And so Thomas Gould, though the same generation, he was much older. So while they were being persecuted in the early days, he probably would have been in favor of it. but it was the actual whipping of Obadiah Holmes that caused him to begin to rethink it. And of course, the preaching of Dunster. He and Dunster were friends. David Benedict said of Thomas Gould, or he just said of Obadiah Holmes, and I think it had a lot of effect on people, but this is what Benedict wrote about the whipping of Obadiah Holmes. Quote, "What on earth can be more shocking to any being who has human feelings than to see a humble and devout Christian who renders to Caesar what is his due, merely for not believing some things which his brethren believe, arrested in his peaceful and pious course, sentenced to be tied to a public whipping post like a malefactor, and there to have his body barbarously scourged, to chastise and to cure the conscientious scruples of his mind. And all this by his countrymen, his neighbors, yea, by his fellow Christians, who profess to worship the same God and to trust for salvation in the same Redeemer. Who can contemplate such a scene of barbarity without being sickened at the sight and retiring from it in disgust and horror?" And that's the effect it had on Dunster and Thomas Gould and other folks there. The First Baptist Church in Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in Swansea, in 1663. And it was 2 years later, in 1665, that the First Baptist Church in Boston was founded by Thomas Gould. And then there was a third founded in 1685 in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Interestingly, the progress of Baptist churches being established in Massachusetts remained painfully slow, as by 1763, only 18 Baptist churches had been planted in Massachusetts. So there were, by 1685, there were 5 or 6 Baptist churches. But from then until 1763, in total there were only 18 that were planted. They were so resistant to Baptists. Though the population had exploded during the same time, so there wasn't a commensurate growth of churches there. So even though Gould planted the church, the standing order would not give up easily, and the Baptists had become bolder, though the persecution continued. Even Isaac Backus, who went through the Revolutionary War, much later, 100 years later, and his contemporaries suffered much in Massachusetts and Boston for the convictions they had. And they continued to fight for religious freedom in the face of the difficulties. But it's interesting, between 1763, so there were 18 churches in 1763, Baptist churches. By 1784, there were 64 Baptist churches. So there was an explosion after the Revolutionary War. No doubt the sentiments changed during the War for Liberty, as they naturally should have. If you didn't see the irony of suppressing one group of people, that when you just fought a war for freedom against tyranny, then you have a problem, right? But Baptists and dissenters still face persecution, I think, into the 1830s in Massachusetts. So a lot further down the road. We get back to Thomas Gould. He had been heavily influenced by Dunster, and like Dunster, he was a man who, once he was convinced of something, was going to act on his convictions. He testified in writing that, quote, "God was pleased at last to make it clear to me by the rule of the gospel that children were not capable nor fit subjects for such an ordinance, because Christ gave this commission to his apostles, first to preach, to make them disciples, and then to baptize them, which infants were not capable of," and which was the year, and he's still talking, 1655. So Gould refused to baptize his child and even attend the church for the baptism, and they sent a note to him, and this becomes a big deal. They sent a note to him to have him appear before the pastor in the pastor's house the next day, or to send word that he couldn't come. Henry Dunster and another man were both present at Thomas Gould's house when a runner came with the note, and Dunster gave him counsel not to appear the next day, so don't go. The church elders accused Gould of not establishing a time that he could come, and said that he had been that they had told him to, if you couldn't come, establish a time that you could come, that had been written into the letter, but that was not the case. Gould was arraigned in court and accused of lying about this matter. So they were charging him with lying about not establishing a time when they had told him to establish a time. And there was no such directive in the letter. And so they were going to pass judgment on this one point, this matter of him lying about whether he was supposed to establish a time or not establish a time. We think, this is ridiculous. And it was, but they needed a pretext. But Gould had a friend with him who had also read the letter, Thomas Wilder. He was the other man who was present when the runner came, and testified that the letter did indeed not have the instruction for Gould to appoint a specific day. And of course, they asked him to produce the letter, not thinking that he would have it, because this was some 8 weeks before. And if he couldn't produce the letter, they were going to chastise Gould. But it happened that he had the letter in his pocket. Thomas Gould, who didn't know his friend had the letter in his pocket, said, quote, "I wondered at it." No doubt he did, as the sovereignty and providence of God were on full display. Gould points out that both Dunster and Wilder were at his house when the letter came, and here's a quote that I'll relate to you from that testimony. Gould says, quote, "After Dunster read it," this is at his house when it came, "he gave it to Wilder to read, who put it in his pants, where it stayed for 9 weeks. The morning of the trial, he had to go a good space from his house, and finding it too cold to go in the clothes he had on, returned again and put on another pair of breeches, which were warmer. And when he had so done, he put his hand in his pocket to see if he had any paper to write with, and there found that letter, and put it in again, and went to meeting, yet not knowing what would be done that day concerning me. God had so appointed it to stop their fierce proceedings against me for a lie, which they sought to take me in." That's amazing. You know what I thought of when he said he'd been wearing those pants and carrying that around for 9 weeks? They didn't do washing much back then. Not like today, right? But that was all of God, right? All of God. The letter proved Gould right, and their, quote, mouths were stopped. However, the leader of the proceeding wanted to go forward with the judgment anyway. He commented, quote, "This is nothing. Let us proceed with him for his judgment." So they didn't care. It was a pretext, right? And we can see how they didn't care about the truth. Here, the letter they had sent proved that they were charging him with something that they were that what they were charging him with about the letter wasn't true anyway. And Gould was absolved of lying, but they wanted to go forward with it, which is a classic kangaroo court. It's the same type of court that Christ was tried in. It was the same type of court that Obadiah Holmes was tried in, that Roger Williams and John Clark were tried in. They didn't care about the truth. They tried to find some pretext. And I think we could face this stuff in the future. You look at the court system today, I can tell you right now, standing trial for something like preaching the gospel, taking a stand for truth and righteousness, in some of these courts, you're liable to go to jail, right, or be heavily fined. And so obviously the lie wasn't an issue. The real reason was to get him before the court because he refused to baptize his infant child. And he saw it as an opportunity to witness the gospel to these men when they asked him why he hadn't presented his child for baptism. So that was the next step. They said, "We want to just go forward with this. Why haven't you presented your child for baptism?" And he said, "I did not see any rule of Christ for it. For that ordinance belongs to such as can make a profession of their faith, as the Scriptures doth plainly hold forth." And they used that same reason we talked about earlier, that circumcision in the Old Testament was the basis for infant baptism in the New Testament. And his answer was that there is a strict command for infant circumcision in the law, but in the New Testament there is no gospel command for infant baptism, only for adult believers. Don't preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Those that have received it, right? So he left, and he was called. This went back and forth for some time. They would come to his house to convince him of his error, demand that he have his child baptized, and he refused. He was actually told that they might take his child and baptize him. They said, "What if we come and take your child and baptize him?" But Gould made it clear that if they did, he would tell the congregation publicly that he had no hand in it, that he disapproved of it. Finally, the deputy governor got involved, because this is having an effect on everybody. This is all public. So the preaching of Dunster, the preaching of Gould, the stand that Gould's taking now, it had they needed to silence him. So the deputy governor got involved and asked him to let the church baptize his child. He told him no. He was publicly admonished by the church for refusing infant baptism, for using contentious words about it, and for the alleged lie that he had told, which he had been absolved of, right? And at that point, he was denied the privileges of membership and the Lord's table. He was accused of rending the church and of creating a schism. Now, this went on for a number of years, right? This isn't just a one-time thing. This is going on. This is always hanging over his head. James Bella points out that, quote, "Thus began an ordeal such as had been never seen in America. For the next several years, the Congregational Church in Charleston tried to convince Gould of his errors. He protested by walking out during infant baptism, by turning his back while a child christening was conducted. He was threatened with beatings, spent time in jail, threatened with excommunication, etc." So he faced a lot, too, for quite a number of years. 8 years, in fact. 8 years later, he was excommunicated, and during that time, he had begun to meet with other Baptists, like-minded people in the area. On November 18th, 1663, his wife was accused of Quakerism. And if you recall what happened to Mary Dyer just 3 years earlier, that you can see why that would have instilled fear in their minds, and that's exactly what it was done for. It was done to intimidate them, to get them to stop, to get them to recant. But it didn't go anywhere because it wasn't true, which I guess doesn't really make any difference. But they did censure Gould. On May 28th, 1665, with Thomas Gould as the leader, Thomas Osborne, Edward Drinker, John George, Richard Goodale, William Turner, Robert Lambert, Mary Goodale, and Mary Newell, they founded the Fifth Baptist Church in New England, the second in Massachusetts. And I read these names because I think it's important. It's like the names we read in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. You know, if I was one who did something very courageous and daring like that, you know, you want to be, I don't think they were thinking about being remembered, but, you know, it's good to honor those people. They were willing to sign their names on the dotted line, so to speak, literally risking everything for what they believed. They were hunted down and summoned to court in August of 1665. And at that point, they had come up with a confession of faith, and they published it as an attempt at making themselves legitimate. But even amidst the threats, they continued to have services. So you think about it. Would we continue to have services if we were under that kind of threat? Or we just say, you know, we'll just let things die down. They kept having services. Thomas Gould and 4 others at this point were disenfranchised for their stand and services. And disenfranchised means that you couldn't conduct business, buy or sell. So you couldn't conduct any business in the colony. In other words, it would make life really difficult for you. They were threatened with long-term imprisonment if they continued to meet. On April 17, 1666, they were fined 20 pounds apiece for contempt of court, 4 pounds apiece for neglect of worship, and 4 pounds for meeting contrary to the law. And they were also imprisoned. The remaining congregation, those were the leaders, the remaining congregation began to meet on Noodles Island. And you and I were there, Steve, what used to be Noodles Island. It's not Noodles Island anymore. It's not an island. The area is now part of the far eastern part of Logan Airport. So I think that's where the runway goes over. You remember when we went down there? Gould and the other leaders were recommended by the Court of Assistants to be banished, but instead the fines were merely upheld by the General Court. Beller writes, quote, "They must have sensed, the court, the General Court, what was about to happen." In other words, I think they could smell the air, stick their finger in the air, and they knew that there was some resistance to some of the things that they were doing. Gould was released from prison. He refused to pay his fine, and he had his property levied for the fine, so they took his property. Gould was arraigned again, acquitted by a jury, had his acquittal reversed by the court, and was challenged to a debate called the Great Baptist Debate of 1668. It was between Gould and his conspirators and 6 congregational preachers. The chairman would be the successor of John Winthrop, Governor Bellingham, who was very much, he hated Baptists. And it's interesting that Governor Bellingham's sister-in-law was hung as a witch in Salem a few years later. Of course, the debate was rigged in favor of the Congo preachers. The question they asked was whether it be justifiable by the word of God for these persons and their company to depart from the communion of these churches and to set up an assembly here in the way of Anabaptism. And as Beller points out, the real issue was the question, quote, "May we have church without your approval?" That was the real issue. This entire debate was recorded and is archived in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. John Clark had also sent emissaries there. He was an old man at this point. Gould was fairly old too. And they wouldn't let Clark's emissaries speak. They wouldn't give them any floor. And but they did say, it's recorded, I think, that they said that the Puritan churches were so corrupt as to be, quote, null and void. That's how bad they were at that point. Most of these, you can't believe that most of these people really knew the Lord. I mean, we don't know for sure. We can't judge their hearts. But they had for so long practiced infant baptism. I think the first Puritans that came over actually were, for the most part, saved. They obviously had some issues, right? And but the second and third generations by that time, they had so long departed from the faith, that I don't think they had a clue. They were totally apostate. Gould was able to courageously and eloquently defend his positions. He set forth unanswerable arguments against infant baptism, but he was declared the loser anyway, right? Because it was a rigged debate. He and his friends were banished by the General Court after the debate as a, quote, enemy to the habitation of the Lord, an anti-New England in New England. If this assembly be tolerated, where shall we stop? Right? And to the English Puritans' credit, and I didn't write anything here other than this about that, but they put a whole letter from them in there. The people, the Puritans in England, when they heard this, they were appalled. And they sent letters of protest to the New England Puritans who ignored their brethren in England. So Thomas is in prison now. He's waiting escort, Thomas Gould, out of Massachusetts. The Baptist Church continued to meet on Noodles Island. And even Obadiah Holmes would sneak up from Newport to preach to them from time to time at this point. And I was thinking about that, it would have been easy for that church to disband. They didn't have a leader. In fact, all of their leaders had been put in jail. They had been banished from the colony. And just getting over to Noodles Island was a real difficulty. It was an island at the time, and you had to take a boat over. But it's a testament to the perseverance and the true salvation of the congregation there, that they continued to meet under such hardships and continued to worship as a Baptist church. And I would hope that we would do the same thing, because I feel like most people, and I'm not talking about us, but I feel like most people would, in the face of that kind of difficulty, they would just disband, and that would be it. In what Beller called a stunning turn of events, and I think it was, the court received a petition signed by 66 leading citizens asking the court to release Gould and the two other leaders. But the court ignored it, but they only ignored it after taking note of who signed it. One of the leaders at that point, that with Gould in jail, his last name was Farnham, he recanted and returned to Increase Mathers Church in Boston. At that point, they don't know why, but a 3-day release was granted to Gould and Turner. And Gould immediately went and did what? Held a church service. But he was being watched, and they came to arrest him and the others, and in the confusion of trying to arrest everybody, he escaped. I don't know how that worked. Both Gould and Turner managed to make it over to Noodles Island, where for the next 5 years, Gould would preach to whomever would come over and hear him. So apparently he lived over there. He built the place over there, and he began to live over there. So he'd lost everything. He'd lost everything in Boston. Everything. And he went over there, and I don't know what he built, but he did something over there. But he was going to preach. And obviously there were some fairly hardy souls that were willing to cross the boat simply so they could worship according to freedom of conscience. It reminds me of a story back when I was pastoring in Passadumkeag. And they told me back in the day, when the river would freeze in the winter, the people would come from across the river to hear the preaching at the Passadumkeag Baptist Church. They'd walk over in the midwinter, cross the river, and get their preaching. So kind of interesting. Not quite as difficult, but nevertheless the same type of thing. A number of other Baptist churches, Baptist congregations, sprang up in various Massachusetts towns. And the guy I mentioned earlier, Governor Bellingham, his response was the English ducking school, ducking, D-U-C-K-I-N-G, ducking school stool punishment, in which a person was tied to a chair at the end of a pole. So you had a pole like on a seesaw, pivot point, and you had a chair tied to the end. They'd put someone in it, they'd tie them to it, they'd gag them, and then you had some guys on the other side, and they'd dunk him in the water. It was aimed at, of course, the Baptists and baptism by immersion. It was a very derisive way of trying to get them to recant the error of their ways. It would have been very humiliating and also life-threatening. From 1669 to 1680, Bellingham brought indictments against all of the 9 congregations that had sprang up in Massachusetts. Bellingham wrote of the ducking school, quote, "The persons shall be gagged or set in a ducking stool and dipped or head and ears 3 times in some convenient place of fresh or salt water, as the court or magistrate shall judge meet." He was a really nice guy. But the Lord was working. A number of things happened during this time that benefited the Baptists. One, the Congregational Church's pastor, John Wilson, died. He was very anti-Baptist. And after the new pastor was installed, their church split over the so-called halfway covenant. And the halfway covenant, if you recall, was the question was, what if people who are unchurched and clearly unsaved want their children to be baptized? What happens to the children? And the halfway covenant was if they were members of the church, they could have their children baptized whether they were living or attending church or not. See, by that time it didn't even matter. They only wanted your money. They wanted you to be members of the church. And Governor Bellingham, who wanted Baptists buried, Beller says he was buried. God buried him. He was the one that was ducking the Baptists. And the new governor, John Leverett, was quite a bit more tolerant of Baptists. So after the deaths of Wilson and Bellingham, the Baptists began to meet back in Boston. So they left Noodles Island. They came over to Boston in the house of one Simon Lind. It was during this time that Thomas Gould died on October 27th, 1675. So really, he suffered for most of the rest of his life from the time that he began to see the light, so to speak, and to come against the standing order when Obadiah Holmes was whipped in 1651 until 1675, so 24 years. He basically faced a whole lot of persecution and lost everything. So a quarter century. One of the commentators pointed out that, quote, his nation should honor him, but does not know who he is. So he was very, very important in our history. And I would say he was as courageous and important a man as Roger Williams and John Clark. And he was in their same generation in age, but he took a stand 2 to 3 decades after they began to take a stand. So he was kind of the one that took over after they did. And it took him longer to see. And God works like that, right? You know, some people, they see it early, and some people it takes a little longer. But the key is that they saw it, and the key is that once they saw it, they were willing to stand for it. That was the issue. So God had his man, and I'll say he had the women who, he had his women too, the women who accompanied them. You know, you never hear as much about the wives and the women, but they took the same stands. I mean, Gould's wife suffered just like he suffered. She lost her house. Can you imagine taking your wife, honey, we're going over to Nudist Island, we've lost everything. And, what do you build over there, a log cabin or whatever it is? I mean, who knows what they did. After Gould's death, 3 years after Gould's death in 1678, the Boston Baptist Church began building in secret. Can you imagine doing that today? On land given to them by Philip Squire and Ellis Callender. And the church was under the temporary leadership of John Miles, who ended up going to Swansea, being the pastor there, and died in the pastorate there. The church began meeting in their new secret building on February 15th, 1679, and ordained a new pastor that same year in July, Pastor John Russell. Right afterwards, of course, a law was passed by the court condemning the building, and this was in spite of letters from King Charles II telling the court to leave the Baptists alone. Don't mess with them anymore. But their leaders were jailed, and the doors were nailed shut in March of 1680. So they came in, arrested the leaders, condemned the building, nailed the doors shut. And the magistrates at this point, the Black Hat leaders, the standing order, they figured they had a total victory. But sometimes the gospel really proliferates when there's persecution. But they soon got word that the doors had been pulled open and the Baptists were meeting there again. And the leaders, the pastors had been let out. And so they summoned the entire church to the court, not just the leaders, but everybody. It would have been like me and all of you. We're all going to jail together. Be holding church in a jail cell, right? So they summoned the whole congregation, and no one went. Can you blame him, right? But instead, they petitioned the court for the right to meet and worship. And the people that they were petitioning were their avowed enemies. So they must, it doesn't say, but surely they were fasting and praying. It's very much like Nehemiah and what he did before King Artaxerxes. He fasted and he prayed. Artaxerxes was no friend of Christianity. But God answered prayer, and God answered prayer here. And that's the amazing thing about it. Maybe it wasn't. I wrote amazingly and providentially. Providentially for sure. The court granted their permission in February of 1681, 6 years after Thomas Gould's death. So he didn't realize, he planted the church, but he didn't see the freedom and everything come to fruition. And I was thinking, man, what a testimony. What an incredible testimony that these people had. And I was thinking, I wonder if I would do the same thing and stand the same way as Thomas Gould would, or those other folks did, when they were faced with the loss of everything just for what they believe. Remember, it's just for what you believe. It's not because you've committed any crime. It's just because you want to come here and worship the way you believe is biblical before the Lord with other like-minded believers. Would you be willing to die for that? And they were. They were willing to die for it. So I'm almost done. As a footnote, and it's worth mentioning though, a number of these great men died at this time. That entire first generation of leaders, and passed the torch to another generation. John Clark died April 20th, 1776, about a year after Thomas Gould. Obadiah Holmes died in October 15th of 1682. And Roger William died in April of 1683. So those are the men that we've been looking at in these classes. And as I mentioned earlier, Gould started later than the rest of them, though he was about the same age. But it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And that's the way it always is. Some of us had a bad start. I had a bad start, but I want to finish well. I want to have that kind of testimony. Here we are reading and studying this stuff 340 years, 350 years later, at times, almost 400 years later. We're reading about these people who took a stand, and they are our heritage. They are the reason that we can worship the way we do and have the freedom that we have to say basically whatever we want, to go wherever we want, to do whatever we want. It's because of those people. And they this was 100 years before the Revolution when these men passed away, but they had a profound impact on the thinking of that time, the next generation, and then the subsequent generation after that, a couple generations down the road, and even the next generation, which would be the generation of Isaac Backus and the men who fought in the Revolutionary War. So we have to, that's really the reason that we're going through this, is so that we can have that connection and understand that this isn't playtime. People have died for what we believe. They've shed their blood for what we preach. And I would hate to do despite to their names and figuratively spit on their graves because we don't see it as important or important enough to even, to sacrifice anything for, let alone everything for. So, hopefully that instills in us that same sort of conviction and desire to take a stand for these things. One of the things we were talking about the other night that with Pastor Mitchell afterwards, he said, we may get to the time where we face some real difficulties in this life. And even at what we were eating earlier before that, we're talking about, all of this could be stripped from us, the abundance. And we could all be on, a level playing field where we have nothing, and food and even the very basics of life become hard to get. And that's when we're really going to have to trust the Lord. Not saying it's going to in our lifetime, but it could, the way things are going. And the issue, of course, then, when things get difficult like that, will we stand like these people did? We'll be willing to stand. Or that's when true conviction, real belief kicks in, and you trust the Lord, and you go forward in Him. So anyway, I'm done.